Good evening, guys. Tonight we are going to be talking about African Americans during industrialization. So our learning target for today is I can explain why African Americans migrated to the north, and I can analyze how de jure segregation affected African Americans in the South. So two learning targets tonight. One, we're talking about why African Americans come, and the second is we're talking about the effects of de jure segregation. If you don't know what that is, no worries, because we're going to go over it in detail during this PowerPoint. Okay, so first things first. Rights for African Americans. So it's 1865. We've just fought the Civil War. The North has won. And so we have to give some rights to African Americans, because after all, that is a primary reason why we fought the Civil War. So there are three amendments that we see created after the Civil War: the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And these are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. Now, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Okay, so slavery is abolished. The 14th Amendment is a very, very complicated amendment. The one thing I want you to take out of it is something known as the Equal Rights Amendment. Okay, so just know it as the Equal Rights Amendment. And the last one is the 15th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment gives voting privileges to African American males. Okay, so black males receive voting privileges. And so these are the three key Reconstruction Amendments. Now, for the sake of this PowerPoint, we're going to be looking primarily at the 15th Amendment, and we're going to look at the 15th Amendment next, because when we're talking about voting rights, a key thing that whites in the South did during this time period was they tried to eliminate African Americans from voting. Okay, real quick, before we do that, one thing, a key term that we have to know when we talk about voting privileges and we talk about voting, the right to vote is known as suffrage. So make sure you know that, because that is a key term. We're going to talk about that a lot more when we get to when we get to women and their right to suffrage. It takes place in 1919. Okay, but for right now, we're going to go back. So how do we eliminate voting privileges? What did whites do in the South to make sure that African Americans still were not able to vote, or at least made it a lot harder? The first thing that they did was they implemented something known as a poll tax. And in a poll tax, you have to pay money to vote. And this is a problem because a lot of African Americans during this time period, they do not have enough money to vote. So if they don't have the money, they can't obviously go and vote because they can't pay the poll tax. Now, in some instances, this also hurt poor white people, but that's okay, because as long as the rich white elite are voting, that's really all they care about. So the first way is a poll tax. The second way is something known as the grandfather clause. And in the grandfather clause, what this says is that if he doesn't vote, if your grandfather does not vote, or didn't vote, then you don't vote. Now, why is this key? Well, it's key because for these African Americans, how many of their grandfathers were able to vote? Answer is probably none of them, because there's a very, very good chance that their grandfathers were all slaves and therefore had no rights to vote. So if their grandfathers couldn't vote, then obviously they could not vote. And the last one was something known as a literacy test. And basically in a literacy test, they had to pass some sort of reading test to make sure that they were, quote, literate. Now the thing here is that oftentimes literacy tests were made easier for whites than they were for blacks. And again, the primary goal here is that we want to keep as many African Americans away from the polls as possible. So that is the key here, and these were the three key ways that they did that. Now, all of those methods were laws that were put into place. And laws that are put into place to segregate or to put down African Americans is something known as de jure segregation. So de jure segregation is just segregation by law. So when it is in writing. And de jure segregation was very, very prominent in the South. Okay, this takes place mainly in the South, where we see de jure segregation. The other type of segregation is something known as de facto segregation. And de facto segregation is segregation by custom. Okay, so we're going to look at some examples of de facto segregation later. The easiest way to kind of decipher the two is, how I always remember it, is de jure segregation. Sounds very similar to jury. And when I think of jury, I think of law. Okay? So think of jury, and then jury equals law, and that's segregation by law. Okay? It's not super critical that you know these two terms, but you probably should. So, the greatest example of Jim Crow or de facto segregation laws, because Jim Crow laws are simply de facto segregation. Or, I'm sorry, de jure segregation. Sorry, guys, I apologize. Jim Crow laws are known as de jure segregation. The greatest example that we see of de jure segregation during this time period is a court case known as Plessy versus Ferguson. In Plessy versus Ferguson, our plaintiff is a guy by the name of Homer Plessy. And Homer is 1/8 African American. And so Plessy wants to go and he wants to ride in the front of a Louisiana train. Okay, so he's on a Louisiana train and he wants to ride in front. Well, when they find out that he is 1/8 black, he's not allowed because Louisiana has something in play known as the one-drop rule. And the one-drop rule says that if you have any ancestry that is African American that we can find, you are considered to be African American, therefore you have to ride in the back. Well, this eventually goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Plessy loses every step of the way. And the argument that they make is that under the 14th Amendment, which talks about, again, equal rights and equal protection under the law, that he should be allowed to sit wherever he wants. Because, again, they are equal. However, the Supreme Court, in a 7-1 decision, go against Plessy. And the thing that they use, kind of what they say, is that as long as the cars are equal, then they can be separate. And this is where we get this famous saying known as separate but equal. And this was huge as far as de jure segregation and Jim Crow laws go. Separate but equal. As long as things are equal, they can remain separate. So as long as bathrooms, as long as schools, as long as all those things are, quote, equal, they can be separate. And we're going to talk more about this tomorrow, how that's essentially not possible. So, real quick, here's some de facto segregation examples. You're not going to be tested on these, but just so you guys are curious. Restaurants, when we look at Remember the Titans, there's a scene in Remember the Titans where they try to all go to the restaurant. The black and the white players try to go to a restaurant after the game, and the restaurant owner refuses to serve the African Americans. It wasn't by law that they were refused. It was by the fact that that restaurant owner did not want African Americans in there. So that's an example of de facto segregation, segregation by custom. Sidewalks, whenever an African American would be walking on the same side as a white person, they would have to cross the street as a sign of respect. Again, not law, but custom. And while it was practiced in the South, this is where we see segregation in the North, because the North really does not have de jure segregation. Most of their segregation is de facto segregation, or segregation by custom. So, how do we win this fight? How do we get African Americans rights, and how do we get them to become equal? Well, there are two key African American philosophers during this time period. The first one was a person by the name of Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington wanted African Americans to take the slowly but surely approach. And basically, he wanted African Americans to kind of gain the respect of whites. So he wanted them to work in trade jobs. He wanted them to work factory jobs, blue-collar work. And that eventually African Americans, by working hard, would gain the respect of whites and eventually would become equal. On the other hand, we have a guy by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. And W.E.B. Du Bois, his key thing was that we need African Americans to receive a great education. And basically, African Americans need to be equal to whites right away. We're going to get a great education. We're going to have these African American young scholars come back, teach other African Americans, and we're going to become educated, and we're going to basically be on par with white people. So as Booker T. Washington wants to do it slowly but surely and through trade schools, W.E.B. Du Bois wanted to do it right away, and he wanted to do it through higher education, which is basically just high school and college. Okay? Last thing, discrimination in the North. First of all, why did African Americans come to the North? Why are they coming to the North? Well, the first one is for jobs. Now remember, during this time period, the South is heavily an agrarian society. It is very, very farm heavy. And because it is so farm heavy, African Americans are losing their jobs. They're losing their jobs by the bundle.
Please call the main
Sorry.
office, 2401. This is McCullough. Please call the main office, 2401. Thank you.
Okay, so because there are so many jobs, because it is such a huge farming society, and because of industrialization, African Americans are losing jobs rapidly. And the second one is pretty easy. It's just treatment, the way that they were treated, mainly with de jure segregation. And they felt that by coming to the North, they would be treated as equals, and they would also have a lot more job opportunities. Did they get what they were looking for? Well, yes and no. When we look at it, there were more jobs, and there was no de facto segregation, or de jure segregation. Okay, so there was no de jure segregation. However, what we do see is that a lot of white people in the North were racist because these African Americans were taking jobs. So just like immigrants were taking jobs, so too were African Americans. And that led to a lot of racial tension, and that led to a lot of de facto segregation. So even though it's not by law, we still see segregation take place in the North. So, quick review. If you were able to explain how de jure segregation affected African Americans, and if you were able to explain the reasons why African Americans migrated to the North, then you are good to go. We're going to talk about this tomorrow. Hope you guys have a great night, and I will see you then.